The British Empire was made possible by the invention of accounting. Okay, maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but the story of how Britain's bankers financed its global domination is one of the most fascinating stories in all of history. So let me tell it to you. Back in 1648, a Swedish scientist named Emanuel Swedenborg wrote this: "Man is a social creature by natural inclination, and his greatest happiness consists in living in society." Well, he was half right. Man is definitely a social creature, and many of us are happiest when we're in the company of others. But the idea that humans are innately inclined towards sociability is not really true. We have to learn to be sociable. And more often than not, we must also learn to be trustworthy, honest and loyal, qualities that define every healthy relationship. But there's one group of people who, arguably, above all others, benefits from other people's trust, honesty, and loyalty. I'm talking about bankers. Because while all other relationships are built on the exchange of goods and services for money, bankers get paid for managing other people's money without having to provide any service at all. Like, imagine if you put your trust in someone else to invest your life savings, and then they blew the lot on trying to buy an island just because they thought it would look good on their resume. Well, that's kind of what bankers do, except with other people's money and without ever asking them. For example, let's take a banker's standard practice of investing clients' money into mortgage-backed securities, which are investments that involve pooling together lots of individual mortgages and then selling shares in those mortgages to investors. Now, these types of financial products can be incredibly lucrative for bankers since they don't have to worry about finding individual borrowers, and instead only need to ensure that the pool of mortgages they've gathered is of sufficient quality. But if you think that sounds like a conflict of interest, well, you'd be right. That's why the job of rating these mortgage-backed securities has been outsourced to companies like Moody's and Standard & Poor's, whose entire business model depends on getting paid by the banks themselves to assess the riskiness of their financial products. Now, obviously, no one would argue that this arrangement makes bankers more honest or trustworthy. But perhaps surprisingly, it does make them more loyal. Because what happens is that when banks package up clients' money and invest it in things like mortgage-backed securities, they very quickly forget that it even exists. They might check in from time to see how the value of their investments have changed, but beyond that, it's completely out of sight, out of mind. That means if there's some massive scandal about those investments, the bank itself is unlikely to be affected. After all, they're not the ones who invested their own money, and so they have both the time and the emotional capacity to fight about it. And that brings us to today's video about how Britain's bankers financed its global domination. Now, to understand how this worked, you first have to understand how British colonialism actually worked. Because unlike other empires before it, Britain never conquered the countries it ruled over. For example, the Spanish conquistadors literally went around killing everyone in the lands they explored, including at least 10 million indigenous Mexicans. Meanwhile, British colonists simply set up shop next to indigenous populations and tried to befriend them. And it was this attitude that made British colonialism so successful. You see, during the 17th century, the majority of European powers saw indigenous populations as either obstacles to be removed or resources to be exploited, and so they treated them accordingly. But by contrast, the British came up with a different approach. You see, while Britain had no qualms about conquering and colonizing North America, it didn't actually want to rule over the majority of its subjects. The British were happy to rule over the land, but much preferred leaving the day-to-day management to local leaders. And that's exactly what they did. For example, after conquering large parts of India, Britain didn't impose its culture on the locals or force them to speak English. Instead, it allowed them to maintain their own cultures and institutions, and mostly stayed out of the way. In fact, the British East India Company, which essentially acted as the government of British India, spent most of its time focusing on making money rather than imposing British rule. That meant they could largely leave the actual administration of the subcontinent to the local rulers, which was great news for the British because it meant that they didn't have to pay for costly colonial administrators or build infrastructure to support them. In fact, This arrangement was so profitable that the East India Company eventually became the largest private company in the world, accounting for 20% of global trade. Now, obviously this wasn't altruism on the part of the British. Instead, it was pure pragmatism. See, Britain's plan for dominating the world involved doing pretty much everything the other European powers were not doing, like, for example, waging wars. That's right. While Spain and Portugal were busy killing each other's missionaries, Britain was signing peace treaties. And while other powers were busy fighting literal battles, Britain was busy building a navy so powerful that no other navy in the world could possibly compete. This was an incredibly expensive endeavor that required tens of thousands of sailors, hundreds of ships, and millions of pounds sterling. And so to fund it, Britain needed bankers. Of course, banking was nothing new. Bankers had been helping kings and queens manage their money for centuries. But until the 17th century, banking was a relatively small industry that was dominated by local Italian and German banks. But that all changed when England decided to start fighting wars. You see, as soon as England realized it wanted to dominate the world, it started printing paper money to pay for it. And that led to the creation of the Bank of England in 1694. From then on, the Bank of England would basically become the financial backbone of the empire. And that meant its bankers would have the unusual task of financing the conquest of the world without actually getting their hands dirty. Now, initially, the Bank of England didn't have the power to create money out of thin air. It was still tied to the amount of gold and silver held in the nation's treasury. But this soon changed after the South Sea Company was created in 1711 with the purpose of colonizing and developing the island of South Georgia near Antarctica. The company was given a monopoly on trade with South Georgia and granted the power to issue currency, which meant it could theoretically create as much money as it wanted, as long as it believed it would be able to find enough resources to back it up. Now, this was an incredible amount of power to hand over to a bunch of businessmen who had proven that they were willing to lie, cheat, and steal to get what they want. But that's kind of the point of a central bank. You hand over control of the economy to unelected bankers because they know how to best serve the interests of the state. And so when Britain handed over the South Sea Company the power to create money, it opened up an entirely new world of possibilities for funding wars without raising taxes. It was a system that gave Britain an unprecedented advantage over its rivals. Let me show you. So while Britain could use the Bank of England to fund wars, it couldn't use it to directly participate in the trade that those wars were funding. That's because the Bank of England was supposed to be a neutral institution that served the interests of all traders, not just those fighting wars. And so to solve this problem, Britain set up the British East India Company, which used the South Sea Company's monopoly on creating money to fund Britain's colonization of India. From there, it was a simple matter of shipping the money back to Britain in the form of silver and using it to expand the empire. And since this was all done through normal trade rather than military conquest, it was extremely hard for other European powers to stop. But once Britain had colonized India, it used the profits from the colonies to fund the Royal Navy, which eventually grew to become the largest navy in the world. And it was this navy that enabled Britain to become the first truly global empire, controlling territory across 5 continents and ruling over almost a quarter of the world's population. Now, unfortunately, it's probably pretty obvious to you that this story doesn't end well for the people being colonized. But for those of us who love numbers, it's got a pretty great ending because the British Empire was ultimately made possible by the invention of accounting. That's right. By the 18th century, the British had developed the modern accounting system that's still used by most companies today. And that meant they could keep track of all the money flowing into and out of the empire. In fact, it was such a well-oiled machine that by 1840, Britain was collecting £1 billion in taxes every single year. That's the equivalent of about £30 billion today. And it all happened thanks to the invention of accounting. Okay, so now you have to watch Worst Ways to Die in the Ottoman Empire or click this other video instead only on Historomystic.